I'm going to talk to you about an interesting and a very current and relevant topic, which we can spend a lot of time on. So we're going to do a condensed version of this, but it will hopefully give you some understanding of the application of this in a work environment, but hopefully hold some value for you as well as an individual. Just briefly, as a clinical psychologist, this is my 22nd year of doing this post-qualification, and I get to spend my time between elite sport. I still do some clinical work where I specialize in mood and anxiety disorders, but we spent a lot of time in the corporate and workspace where we work with high-functioning, intelligent people, but who find themselves under a lot of pressure, and therefore looking at how do we actually look at the factors involved in performance under pressure, generally just applying yourself and your skill set in a good way to be able to maximize what you do from an individual perspective. Just to create a backdrop about living in the digital age, it's probably the easiest times in human history, but with all the upsides, there will be some challenges, unfortunately, coming our way as well. Now, technically, they define the digital age as the late 1970s, where information access was more digitized and became easier. But effectively, we see this happening from the late to mid-1990s onwards, where things really started having an interesting impact. The fact that we live in this digital age also specifically means the volume and the pace at which things are developing seem to be quite exponential. And just an interesting stat to show you how things picked up pace over time. They talk about the market penetration rate of how long it takes a particular product to reach 50 million people. And you can see originally with the radio, it was 38 years, and then with the original telephones, about 20 years. TV, 13. The speed started picking up with mobile phones, around 12 years. The internet, 4 years only. The original iPods, about 3 years, and then Facebook, 2 years. One of my personal favorites, Angry Birds, 35 days. So you just see the pace at which things are picking up, and I think it's quite a nice summary to show what we are dealing with. Now, the human brain has always been designed to deal with large volumes of information. The brain is versatile, it's able to adapt and adjust. But living in the information age, probably never before did we have to adjust to so many things so quickly in such a short space of time. This interesting stat from recent research suggests that the amount of information we have to process daily has tripled in the last 5 years. Now, it doesn't seem like much because the brain has always been designed to deal with large volumes and go with the times. But the impact that this is having is quite significant because physically your brain cannot process everything it's being bombarded with. There are some processes in the brain that will work quite quickly, others that take a lot of effort and energy in order to process information. Which effectively means if the brain can't process everything it's encountering, the brain will put certain filters in place that will allow you to process some information, and unfortunately other things you will just miss because of how the filters are programmed. I think if you literally had to process everything, your brain will probably catch fire in your skull and start melting, dripping out of every orifice, every space in your face, which the brain will stop that from happening. So one of the key things we see coming into play is a very interesting neuropsychological principle called the Waziati principle, which is an acronym that's short for what you see is all there is. What you see is all there is, meaning any information you hold in your short-term working memory or information you can easily recall from the long-term memory because it's been placed there over time through repetition and exposure, will disproportionately affect the way that you respond in the moment. Judgment, decision-making, behavior, reaction. And this is why things like social media, for example, plays a huge role, because the last thing you've encountered plays a role in terms of it sticks somewhere there in the working memory. You cannot unread something once you've read it. You cannot unhear something once you've heard it. So it all starts chipping away at the way the filters are being influenced, and therefore what we see and how we respond. It's also quite interesting that it's not a very scientific way of stating it, but they say in layman's terms that you become the average of your 5 closest friends, because the company you keep, the conversations you have, the things you discuss, how you discuss it, also starts changing and chipping away at these filters, which plays a very interesting role in terms of how we go through life. When we talk about psychological capacity, it actually means the ability for the brain to to acquire information, hold on to information, process information for whether this is a physical task or a mental task that you need to do or creativity. It's all about the application of skill under pressure. And we see this a lot in the general workspace, that very often your skill set will get you there, but the ability to stay there for a long time is how you then apply the skill. And whether you like it or not, everything we do is regulated by these top 9 inches. So understanding the working of the brain and how to maximize this really helps us not only under pressure to apply ourselves well, but generally be able to apply our skill sets in the best possible way. When we find this information overload, where we are being bombarded with too much and we can't process everything and we need to distinguish between what's important and what not, we reach this capacity of information overload. And we generally see 3 areas being heavily affected by this. People get distracted, so it's quite difficult to stay on top of everything happening around me. Now, because I'm distracted, I can't deliver, I don't do the work in time, I feel the pressure from deadlines, etc. And doing this long enough, people start feeling disengaged. So the energy starts dipping a little bit. You still have the intention to do everything you want to, but it becomes quite difficult with the energy dropping and disengagement playing an interesting role in facilitating things like burnout. But eventually, if you stay in that state for long enough, either disengaging from people or from work, we find people getting distressed. And that's where the common mental disorders tend to play in. If these 3 areas are the challenges we face, getting distracted, disengaged, or distressed, the solutions therefore have to sit in how do we manage these 3 areas. And I'm going to give you a light touch snippet of what are some of the most important factors you need to consider when we deal with these things. Firstly, to optimize distraction, we have to optimize focus. Now, when we talk about the impact of focus, if you just look at the way we work nowadays, if you look at somebody's taskbar on their computer, you'll see all these things being open at the bottom. And generally, the way we will work during the course of a day is you're busy with that PowerPoint presentation, and oh yeah, that reminds you to go and have a look in your email, and that takes you back into that Word document, and you quickly just want to go and check the figures in the Excel spreadsheet. So we jump from one thing to the next. We're busy all the time, and all along while we are doing this, you see that little email banner popping in on the side as well. Now, the problem with that is, once that thing pops in, it triggers a chemical reaction in the basal ganglia in the brain. That's the equivalent of an alcoholic craving a drink. Studies done by Professor Dan Levitin, MIT neuroscientist, showing the impact of something like this. So you can't help it. Automatically, you'll extend your hand, take the mouse, click on something, and now you're all over the place again. So we get very distracted by everything happening just the way that we work, which is far from obviously maximal in terms of how we want to maximize and apply our skill set. Just for the sake of interest, if you then ignore that little email banner popping in, the Levitin study showed that it's the equivalent of dropping your IQ by about 10 points. Luckily, not accumulatively, you're not going to be at 0 by the end of the day, but situationally, you can imagine the impact it's having because you kind of know it's there, but you need to focus on what you're busy with, which is not a great way to work. The other problem we see with the brain is the brain doesn't assign importance to the information coming in or the decisions you have to make. The brain doesn't decide what's important or what not. So every text message you answer, social decision you have to make, financial decision, business decision, relational decision, eats into this limited capacity resource, which is focus and concentration. Now in English, the term is, they say you pay attention. And it's a very good way of stating it because every time you focus on something, you actually pay a price for it. But you pay in terms of the energy capacity of the brain and the neurotransmitters, the chemicals happening in the brain. So if you go through this range of making decisions all day long, you reach decision fatigue at the end of the day because a very big role player in our ability to regulate our mood, but to focus and concentrate, is one of our 6 major neurotransmitters in the brain called dopamine, which plays a very interesting role in things like motivation, the reward system in the brain, focus and concentration, and mood regulation as well, for that matter. So I want to give you a crash course in 5 minutes in terms of how the human attention system works. And you'll see how you can apply this in a work environment to better design your environment to not get distracted. When I'm lecturing this to the master's and doctoral students, I probably spend about a week on this concept. So I'm going to do the crash course version in about 5 minutes. But what it's coming down to is that everything you experience as a human being is effectively a combination of chemical and electrical interpretation in the brain. Now, I mentioned 6 key neurotransmitters, which will play a huge role, dopamine being a key one, specifically in the thinking part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So the part you use to focus, concentrate, all your other executive functions, judgment, decision-making, word processing, analytical thinking, deductive reasoning, error correction. So doing your job, being the smart individual that you are, you need that part of the brain, and you need this chemical, this dopamine, to be there and be available. Now, if you simplify the human attention system, we've got 2 primary modes in which we operate. So in your task mode, which is the focus mode, this is the central executive. Anytime you focus on a particular document, working on an intense piece of work, having to think in a meeting, strategize, plan, all of those higher order factors, the brain dips into this mode. And you are very much dependent on the availability at optimal levels of dopamine to stay in this mode. Now, unfortunately, the brain can only do it for up to a certain period of time, which is not coincidentally, but I think directly correlating with the human attention span. Now, what we see in research at the moment, depending on how interested you are in what you're doing, that can be between 20 and maybe 40 minutes, although some of the latest research suggests that this is now dropping down to between 8 and 18 minutes. And specifically because of how we use technology as well, because every time you focus on something, you use some of the dopamine. So you work for 3 hours straight, you're almost close to dopamine depletion, and what you do now is you take a break when you get up, but the first thing you do is hand in the pocket phone out, you still use dopamine. You sit at your desk having a sandwich at lunchtime, surfing the internet, doing a bit of shopping, still uses dopamine. You get up and you go for a walk, but you're busy reading the news, still uses dopamine. So we get this dopamine depletion back end of the day, and the problem with this is your brain is only about 2% of your total body weight, but it can consume up to about 25% of the calories you use. It's a very labor-intensive thing for the brain to produce these chemicals, which effectively means that they say in a difficult meeting, if you sit in a challenging meeting working with fine print, tough contract, you can burn up to about 100 calories an hour just by using your brain. Now, sadly, you can't burn more than that. You cannot think yourself into a six-pack, so it's not enough to really offset some of the effects of sitting down and bad eating habits. But you can imagine the impact on energy depletion at the back end of the day, where we just reach that space where you feel completely fatigued, difficult to make decisions, can't apply yourself. Even if you're not in an intense meeting, just by reading in an average day, about 45 calories an hour you can burn. So staying in this mode is very labor-intensive for the body, and you can't do this continuously all day long. At some stage, your body will hijack you and pull you into this other mode, which is called the default mode, which is effectively the mind-wandering or recovery mode for the brain. Now, to go into this particular mode, 2 other chemicals in your brain need to go into sync. One is called GABA, one is called glutamate. And once they reach an optimal balance in the brain stops using dopamine at that point in time, and your body actually goes into a state of recovery. Calorie use will drop down to about roughly 10, 11 calories an hour, so quite good for energy preservation as well. But that's the state of mind you have to be in for optimal creativity, innovation, problem solving. This is why if you ever had writer's block, you cannot think yourself into a creative state. You actually need to disengage and allow these other chemicals to go into place. But every time you focus on something, you throw this sync out of kilter. So the ability to have these small pockets during the day where you step away from technology, step away from your desk, and we're not talking about taking an hour break every hour. Realistically, sustainably, what we're talking about is give or take on the hour, as little as 3 to 5 minutes, where you just get up, take a walk, leave your phone behind, do nothing. Now, doing nothing is a weird concept in modern times. We're not used to doing nothing. So effectively, what we are saying is you have to sit there staring out the window, just kind of doing nothing. There's a risk that your colleagues might think you're having a small seizure or there's something wrong because you're not used to seeing people doing nothing. But that's kind of what we need to do. So go for a stroll, leave the phone behind, and make sure you dip into this other part of the brain as well. You cannot be in both at the same time. It's yin or yang. It's one or the other. So unless you allow your brain the time to recover, and unless you allow your brain the time to sometimes just revigorate, you're going to find yourself emotionally and mentally depleted come at the back end of the day. And then simple decisions become quite a difficult thing to do. To switch between tasks, this is the filter that you see up there on the screen. It's regulated by a part in the brain called the insula, which will help you to switch from one to the other. But every time you switch, it also uses a bit of energy. So the more you jump from one thing to the next, the quicker you burn through these brain chemicals. So technically, we use the word multitasking, which is not the issue, because that means concurrent work streams. So you do things together. The problem we have is task switching, jumping from one to the next. Because every time you switch between tasks, it takes a little bit more energy, it takes the brain that little bit longer to adjust to it, which depletes the energy quite significantly by the back end of the day. So how you work, how you structure your time, how you manage your diary plays a huge role in not getting distracted in the moment. Now, if you get distracted too often and you don't keep up with the pace and you don't deliver on deadlines, now we start seeing the energy dipping as well. And this is where people start getting disengaged because mentally you are fatigued. And I think the best way to describe this, the difference between fatigue and exhaustion, is fatigue is what you feel before you go to bed at night. Exhaustion is if you wake up the next morning and you're still tired. That's exhaustion. And that's where you start going into a dangerous space. But once we reach this mental exhaustion, which is the precursor for burnout as well, we start getting disengaged. And we disengage from people, we disengage from meetings, we disengage from what we need to do. We sometimes just disengage from ourselves and our well-being because now you're against the clock all the time trying to meet deadlines, but you're busy, but you're not functional. And I always say, don't confuse motion with progress. Just because you're busy doing something does not mean you are moving forward. So what we find is, specifically the way we use technology then has an influence on our ability to engage optimally with people, especially as well. So very often we retreat from talking to people in person and we start sending text messages, writing emails and WhatsApps. And the problem with written communication is then the strain it puts on relationships, or the potential strain, because two things happen. Number one is you type tough. You will type things that you will not say to somebody's face, which especially if your mood is not regulated, you can say things that you probably won't say to somebody's face. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the person receiving the message will project their own tone of voice on what they read. So messages get misinterpreted in writing because of the state of mind the receiver might be in as well, which clearly further influences relational dynamics. When we do a lot of meetings on Zoom, on Teams, etc., you see the top 25% of a person. Your brain has to work so much harder to interpret micro cues, body language, listen, kind of put tone of voice to what the brain is picking up on. And I've seen some interesting studies suggesting that it can actually burn through the dopamine process in the brain almost at twice the speed, which effectively means an hour on a Zoom call is like 2 hours in person. Your brain works so much harder, and you can imagine the implication this is having for how we structure our day. When do we do meetings? How much time do we leave in between? Do we have those breaks, etc.? But what it also will do is once you reach that state of dopamine depletion, we see not only is it difficult to regulate your mood, but the stress levels tend to go up as well, which again has a profound knock-on effect on various areas of how we engage with people and with our teams. The final thing we want to look at is, so we optimize our focus, we optimize our engagement, our ability to work with people, engage with people in relationships. But optimizing our well-being is probably the most neglected area because we are so performance-focused that we don't realize you can only perform if you are recovered well. When we talk about optimizing well-being, I generally like to talk about the 7 functional behaviors, things we can blend into busy work environments, not add on top of or kind of your already overloaded days, just bring more in there, but things you can blend into how you do things. Now, in a shorter version, I'm going to share 3 things with you, which I believe are some of the most important things you can do for yourself from a well-being perspective. Number 1, ladies and gents, have a plan. Have a plan around your diet, have a plan around your structure of your week, how you manage your diary, how you exercise, how you move. You cannot hit the ground running on a Monday morning and hope for the best. Just go through the motions and hope you survive. Because what's going to happen, you're going to get distracted and eventually disengaged. We've noticed that even if you have a bad plan, you are still better off than somebody without a plan. Because at least a bad plan gives you a starting point and a reference to say, why are things not working? If you don't have a plan, you're always going to be all over the place trying to engage in everything and eventually doing nothing. So make sure that you have a plan. However, for me, the single most important thing you can do for yourself, the easiest win with the greatest results, one of the most neglected areas, but it's low-hanging fruit. In sports psychology, we call this the no talent required aspect. You don't have to be particularly gifted or talented to do this. You just need to know that this is important to do. Comes back to physical movement. And what I mean by physical movement is not the 5K run or going to the gym or going for a bike ride. Very important, please don't get me wrong, very important from a health and weight perspective. In terms of building psychological capacity, you don't have to remember everything. Just remember there's a reason and a process behind this. And here goes the crash course in 2 minutes on this. That part highlighted in the brain, it's called the hippocampus. It's the brain's primary memory formation center. It acts a little bit like a train junction with a lot of info going in there and then activating other neural pathways in the brain. To the back end of that, there's a very basic, simple structure called the mammillary bodies, which effectively instigate movement in your arms, your torso, your head, and your neck. And for a long time, scientists couldn't figure out why this simplistic bit is situated between the sensory motor integration part of the brain and memory formation center, meaning in a very important part of the brain. What they figured out in recent years is the fact that once you actually start moving, it's a prehistoric mechanism. As a hunter or a gatherer, it told the brain, this person is in motion, they're walking, they're busy moving, switch on, so that you can start mapping the terrain, remember where you saw food sources, water sources, the next hostile tribe. So the brain releases a chemical, protein-based, called brain-derived neurotrophic growth factor, BDNF. We will just call it brain fertilizer. It starts releasing brain fertilizer, and if there's enough over time, so therapeutic levels, it goes to the back part of that memory formation center called the dorsal hippocampus, and it activates two important things. Neurogenesis, which is the creation of new brain cells from the cerebellum, so it protects your current white and gray matter. And the second thing it will do, it activates lateral neural pathways into the lateral prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain you use to stay focused, concentrate, stay motivated, and to regulate your mood. So you can see the impact it's having on the previous two things we've discussed already. If you don't move, if you are chained to your desk and you sit there and you don't move for 5 or 6 hours, which is very easy to do, let's be honest, before you blink twice, it's lunchtime and you haven't moved, there's not enough brain fertilizer. So the activity shifts to the front part. It's called the ventral hippocampus, which is closely attached to your amygdala, which triggers the stress response, the release of cortisol, the stress hormone, and also the hypothalamus, which regulates eating, drinking, sleeping patterns. So 4 things tend to happen when that part of the brain lights up. Number 1, stress levels go up. Number 2, it interferes with your sleeping capability. You'll be tired, go to bed, but you still don't feel the need to sleep. The third thing that happens actually is then you find that your brain starts craving simple carbohydrates. You get up 4 hours later and you have the munchies. You want to find anything sweet, stuff your face with a cookie or a chocolate bar or sweet coffee or Red Bull, anything you can do to just give you some energy. But what we also see is, fourthly, it activates your medial prefrontal cortex, generally associated with defensive, aggressive reactions. You get grumpy, short-fused, irritable. So simple things, but that will have a huge impact on relational dynamics, how you engage with your team, how you deal with your family, things affecting your well-being, things affecting your performance. So as little, ladies and gents, as 3 to 5 minutes worth of walking on the hour can help your brain reach therapeutic levels of brain fertilizer. Now combine this with my previous point, meaning that roughly on the hour, if you can get up, leave your phone behind, step away from the computer, go for a walk, do nothing, maybe even have a drink of water in the process, without interfering with your workday, you can maximize your capacity from a brain perspective significantly by the back end of the day. If you try this for 3 weeks in the way I prescribe this, and you don't feel a difference, please email me directly, and I will profusely apologize for wasting your time. I'm not getting any comebacks on this. You'd be surprised to see how effectively something as simple as this can be. So please keep that one in mind as a simple 1% you can take forward. And then lastly, you can see how it blends into my previous point as well. When you then do get up, please leave the phone behind. The world will not stop revolving around its own axis just because you don't check your email for 3 to 5 minutes. So give your brain and yourself that break, the opportunity to rest and recover, and then get back into the working day. So even if you still work a long day, well, especially if you then work a long day, building these basic factors in there will have a tremendous impact on how you feel back end of the day, how you regulate your mood, how you engage with people, and how well you perform under pressure. So it's a few simple things, ladies and gents, but hopefully it's a few actionable points you can take away from here. If we had more time, I'd love to give you a few more things. But if nothing else, I want to create the awareness and leave you with the 3 simple points in terms of how do you stay engaged, how do you optimize your focus, and specifically looking after your well-being. That's as much as I can give you in the time available. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.